Hey, what's up? Nico DPS here once again, and today we're going to go over some useful tips for gearing your character out on League Start. I see a lot of newer players especially make some very simple mistakes just because they don't have the knowledge when it comes to some of the modifiers on gear not being created equally depending on what piece of gear it is on. So we'll go over that. We'll go over how to use a little bit of an intro on how to use Craft of Exile and how to search for certain modifiers on the trade website, as well as go over some good flasks. That's another big one I see a lot of newer players make, because their flasks are just terrible, and flasks are an incredibly strong modifier to your character, so we'll also touch on that as well. So if that sounds useful to you, if that can help you out, go ahead and stick around and let's get started. Alright, so to kick things off, I'm going to go over the absolute necessities of gearing your character. And for prefixes, that's going to be ways to scale your HP pool. And what I mean by HP is either life, energy shield, or even ward. However, I'm not going to touch on ward here because it's likely you don't need this video if you're playing ward. It's a very niche and complicated mechanic for the most part, and you likely know most of these things. So for the most part, we're going to be talking about life and ES based here. So every single piece of your gear, whether it be armor or jewelry, can roll ways to scale your HP pool. And that is absolutely imperative to the durability of your character and making sure you stay alive and making sure you can take the amount of damage that these higher tier maps can do to you, right? So basically on every single prefix, especially early on, you want to be looking for energy shield or life on every single prefix, at least one prefix that can scale that up. That way your character stays nice and durable as you progress your character. Now for suffixes, the most important thing here is getting resistance cap. And resistance cap is this number right here. It's 75% throughout the entire game, and then the total amount of resistance on your gear after penalties of killing Katava is in the parentheses on the right. Now I recommend most newer players to go for at least around 90% total resistance, which is the number in the parentheses over here. You want to have at least 90%, even 100%. That's usually what I run around with if I can help it, because you want to have a bit of a buffer there to protect you from map modifiers and monster modifiers that can actually reduce those resistances, right? Sometimes there's map and monster modifiers that when they hit you or when you're just running around on the map, you have reduced resistances. So you want a bit of a buffer there to make sure you still stay at resistance cap. So with that out of the way, now we can go into the nitty gritty and how you can actually play around with some of these things and get more value out of your character and out of your gear. That way you're nice and durable and speedy and do enough damage to push towards those higher tier maps. Okay, so your character's got a nice HP pool going. You got your resistances a bit above cap for that buffer for the nasty map and monster modifiers. What's the next thing you should really be looking for? Well, if you ask me, that's definitely going to be movement speed, specifically movement speed on your boots and running a Quicksilver Flask. I'm not going to touch too much on the veiled modifiers on boots here. I'm just going to touch on your base movement speed rolls. I'd recommend most people, once you get into maps, you really want to look for a pair of boots with at least 25% movement speed. Movement speed is a very important mechanic in this game. It's powerful both defensively and offensively. Defensively, it allows you to dodge mechanics far, far easier, and offensively, it allows you to get to that next monster pack and get into the next zone or get into the next map a lot quicker. So make sure you got a nice movement speed roll on your boots first and foremost, and go for everything else afterwards. And now on the Quicksilver Flask, you should always be running a Quicksilver Flask. In almost every scenario, Quicksilver is one of your most important flasks you need to be running because, like we touched on earlier, movement speed is very, very powerful in this game, and you should absolutely be looking for ways to scale it up. All right, now let's get into really extracting the most value out of your suffixes as you can on your gear. And for this section of the video, I'm going to be touching on jewelry. I have an amulet and a ring here, but it does also work with belts. Belts are a jewelry slot technically in the game. So what I recommend most people do, especially earlier on in the league, where you have to meet a lot of attribute requirements and you have a lot of resistance requirements, is I recommend most people get a ton of attributes on their amulet. And the reason behind that is not only do a lot of amulets have an attribute implicit modifier on it, it also has by far the highest value of an all attribute suffix of any other piece of gear. So I have an amulets up here on Craft of Exile, and then we scroll down, we go to all attributes. Look at this, 30 to 35 all attributes from a single suffix on its highest roll, right? That is incredible value. If we look at something like a ring here, a tier 1 roll is only 13 to 16. So you really have a very high chance to get a really high amount of attributes on your amulet, which makes it even more powerful when you start using catalysts, right? Intrinsic catalysts are usually very cheap, and they add a quality modifier onto your jewelry that increases your attribute modifiers by another 20%. So you scale up those attributes, all those attributes on that amulet, by another 20%. So you get a lot of value for not very much currency, and it allows you a lot more flexibility with gearing the rest of your character. Right next to it over here, I have a sapphire ring with a boatload of resistances. Let's take a look at the total amount here. So 206 total resistances on this single ring. Now this ring is obviously overkill. It's not what you're likely going to acquire early on in the league, but I figured it was a perfect example of just how crazy you can really go with a single piece of jewelry when you stack up a lot of one modifier on it and then scale it up even further with Catalyst. So a very good example of here just how crazy it can really get, and it's going to open up a lot more options for you with your other pieces of gear, and maybe go for some offensive modifiers, which we'll touch on next. Okay, so the next thing we're about to touch on here, you might have picked up on earlier when we were talking about amulets, and that is all suffixes are not created equally depending on the piece of gear it's coming on, right? As you can tell with the amulets, it had a chance to roll a much higher tier modifier for all attributes than every other single piece of gear that has the ability to do so. And that also applies to other affixes as well. As another example here, I'm going to use rings and gloves for attack speed. Now on the left here, we have rings. It can only roll 5 to 7% attack speed, right? That's the only tier of the modifier it has. It can only go up to 7%, except for essences, but we won't touch on that. Now, but for gloves, for the price of a single suffix as well, it can actually roll up to 14 to 16%. So for the price of the same suffix, one suffix, I'm getting over double the value for the exact same modifier. And I think that's a very important thing you should pay attention to, especially on things that are not resistances, right? Because with resistances, as we can use here, let's say cold resistance, all the tiers of modifiers are the exact same regardless of what piece of gear it is on, either armor or jewelry. The resistance modifiers are always going to be the same, so they kind of set the benchmark for the value of a suffix, and you kind of want to compare like, okay, if I'm going to give up a chance at a high resist roll, I want to make sure I get the most value of that affix I need to go for instead. So make sure, let's say as attack speed as an example, if you need attack speed and you don't have a lot of room to go for it, but you can give up one suffix, go for the attack speed on your gloves, for instance. Don't go for it on the rings because you're going to get far less value. All right, so I've told you guys what you should be looking for on your gear and things of that nature. Now let's show you how to actually go find it yourself and how you can actually teach yourself where certain affixes are popping up on gear, and in turn how to find them on the trade website. So for this example, we're going to be using a ring because rings are usually pretty universal for a lot of builds, whether you're a caster or melee. They usually want fairly similar things on your standard rare rings. So we're going to click on jewelry. I'm going to click on ring, and now we get a nice list of our base prefixes and suffixes that can roll on a ring. And let's say we need some cold resistance. So we click on cold resistance. We see, okay, all right, I need about 35 cold resistance. So let's search for tier 3 cold, right? So what that tells us here, if we click on tier 3 cold, we need to start our search with at least 36%. That's going to make sure we get at least 35% out of it, and we bump up one more tier so we kind of increase the pool, right? And now also we want life. Now we want really, really good life. We want tier 1 life, right? So we know we need to search for at least 70 life. All right, we're at the trade website here. Now let's type in our item category, which is a ring. Our rarity, I usually just type in any non-unique rarity for that, unless I'm specifically searching for one. That way it limits the pool. Now let's say, oh, we want an amethyst ring base, right? So if we just type in amethyst ring here and we select the one that's just an amethyst ring, no any named uniques. Now anything that pops up is going to be an amethyst ring that is not unique, which is perfect. That's what we're wanting. Now let's type in the things we want. We know we want life, and the tier 1 is 70. So one mistake a lot of people make here is they'll use pseudo modifiers, and it will make the pool way too large because it's going to add anything that it can increase your total maximum life pool, right? Which, as an example here, is going to be strength, right? You can type in pseudo maximum life of 70, and you can find a ring that has 60 maximum life and then like 20 strength, which can reach the threshold for 70 maximum life, which you don't want, right? So make sure you pay attention to explicit, click on that, and then type in what you're looking for. This is only going to pull up specifically the maximum life roll of at least 70. Same thing with our cold resistance. Explicit cold resistance, type in 36, and now we want to make sure we add in empty prefix modifiers. So if we just type in prefix here, it gives you an option you can see here. Don't worry about the pseudo tag here. You get the option here for empty prefix modifiers. We type in our minimum at 1. That means at minimum there's going to be at least one empty prefix modifier, which is good. We want to be able to craft on that prefix, right? Now we don't want any crafted modifiers on the item, just for simplicity's sake. We don't want any crafted modifiers on it. So if we hit add a stat group down here, and we hit not, and then if we type in crafted, you see down here it says crafted modifiers. And if you just click it there, you don't even need to put anything in. You just put in crafted modifiers. Now anything you search is not going to have a crafted modifier. It's going to have one empty prefix and the things we want on an amethyst ring base. Now, last thing you usually want to do if you're trying to craft on something is make sure it's not corrupted. So scroll down to miscellaneous, corrupted, select no, and now hit search. And now look, any item we're searching for, all of them are amethyst rings. All of them have an open prefix, and none of them have a crafted modifier on them, so we can craft on ourselves. So this is an easy way that you can learn how to search on the trade website and find exactly what you need. I hope this helped you out. Okay, last but certainly not least is Flasks. This is one of the most common mistakes I see a lot of newer players make. They send me their build because they need some help. I go take a look at their Flasks, and it is a complete disaster, which is definitely what you want to avoid. Flasks are an extremely powerful defensive and offensive mechanic if you know what to look for on them. So let's start off with a life flask. A lot of people are going to be playing life-based characters, and usually you're going to be looking for something like this right here. Either a half instant and half recovery based, or maybe even a full instant if that's what you prefer on your prefix, right? And then on the suffix, most people are going to be running a bleed immunity flask, which is very important. Bleeding and corrupted blood are extremely dangerous mechanics, and you want to make sure you can take them out of the equation. And most people just run it on their life flask because that's usually what you're going to be clicking anyways. If you see corrupted blood or bleeding on you, just chunking your life pool. So usually this is what a life flask will be looking like, what you should be looking for when you're running them. Up next, we're going to go over some defensive flasks that are going to correlate to what aura you're running. Let's use Determination and Grace as an example. We'll use Grace here. If I'm running Grace, I want to run a Jade flask, right? Because if Evasion is a very strong defensive mechanic, I'm trying to scale it via Grace. So let's try and get our evasion as high as possible, right? Same thing applies to a determination. With determination, you'd use an armor flask. Now, on the suffix specifically, you can get increased evasion rating or armor rating during flask effect. Now, if you're running Grace, you'd run evasion, and if you're running determination, you want armor during flask effect, right? So for this flask right here, I have a Jade flask with increased evasion as well on top of it. Now, the prefix isn't perfect right now, but I just grabbed this as an example. But you really want to make sure, especially on your suffixes, to get them right, because it's going to protect your character from a lot of unnecessary deaths. If you're running Grace, run a Jade flask with increased evasion. Same thing with determination, run a Granite flask with increased armor. And then with the prefixes, you can sort those out later. But usually, if you're early on in a league, anything that has to do with like max charges or a charge when hit, or if you're crit based, maybe some charges when you crit, all of those will do pretty good and help you sustain your flasks. Now, there's also some other good suffixes on flasks that maybe on a different flask you can go ahead and grab. Another very strong one is Reduced Effect of Curses. This is a very powerful one. A lot of times when you're rolling maps, you're going to have a curse on you, and you can just take over half of it out of the equation completely, especially with something like Temp Change. It's going to make it a lot less annoying for you to run a Temp Change. So make sure on one of your flasks you can try and get Effect of Curses reduced if you can afford to do so. Now, lastly is immunity to shock and ignite and freeze. These are also very powerful flasks if you are not ailment immune, which is going to be most people, especially at the start of the league. I highly recommend, if you have to pick two to go for, right? If you have to pick two ailments to go for to get immune to, you're going to want to go for shock and you're going to go for freeze. Ignite isn't too dangerous usually, and if you do have a problem with ignite, usually you can just pop your life flask and it's not too bad. I'm going to either go for shock or freeze immunity, because freeze is especially extremely deadly. You're frozen for up to like 3 or 4 seconds, which is an eternity, and you want to take that out of the equation if you are not ailment immune. So make sure you got some sort of shock immunity and freeze immunity, most importantly, on one of your flasks if you are not ailment immune. Now, lastly, when it comes to a Quicksilver flask, if you are already got all of your ailments taken care of, you have your corrupted blood immunity taken care of, usually something very good to go for is just additional movement speed on your flasks. That's also very powerful, as we went over earlier. Movement speed is very powerful, so try and get some more specifically on your Quicksilver, because when you're popping your Quicksilver, you want to move faster anyways, so you might as well make it even better. Now, on the prefix as well, you can see here I have increased effect and reduced duration. That's a good one. Also, just flat increased duration with no increased effect. You can get up to like 40%, which is also very strong. There's a lot of different strong prefixes on flasks. It's just up to what build you are running, but this is the one I decided to go with. Also, lastly, here you can see I have a like an enchant on it, right? For my orb, you can use these orbs right here. I'm going brain dead on what they're called. Yeah, you can use usually instilling orbs. Unless you use a Maze Blood, you can go for enkindling, but most people are going to make use of instilling orbs, and the best one I would recommend getting is to use when charges reach full. This is going to allow you to basically automate your flask for the most part, not really have to worry about them. If they reach full charges, it'll just automatically use it, which makes it very efficient with your flasks. So this is kind of what you should be looking for with your flask setup. That way you can extract as much defensive and offensive value on your flasks, and makes the gameplay a lot smoother. So that about does it for me for this video. If this video helped you out, if you liked it, please drop a like. It helps out a lot. If you want to see more content in the future, feel free to drop and subscribe. I'll be posting as much as I can. This new league's got me all hyped. I'll be posting more soon. I think up next I might be doing a crafting video. We will see, kind of the basics of the crafting. So stick around for that if you want to see it. So that'll do it. Thanks again for watching till the end, and I'll see you next time.